The Spirited Performance. Upter Grove, Ontario. By contrast, the ghostly organist at St. Columbo's Church at Upter Grove near Orilla had no problem with being visible. He was even dressed for the occasion when he gave a brief recital in late March of 1964. More than 40 years later, Susan Wallace could still clearly remember how he looked and how upset she was when she saw him. Wallace and her two sisters were helping their mother and another woman clean the church just before Easter. Suddenly, a mysterious white-faced figure, all dressed in black and wearing a top hat, appeared in the choir loft. He sat down at the organ and began to play. Worried that the stranger might be up to no good, her mother and the other woman climbed the stairs to ask him what he was doing there. When he reached the loft, he backed away without answering and entered the bell tower room, letting the door to it swing closed after him. The two women followed him, but were completely taken aback to find that the small, windowless room was empty. The door they had just come through was the only way in and out of the room, and the white-faced man hadn't gone past them. He had simply disappeared. Dining with the Dead, Vancouver, British Columbia. Old buildings sometimes have strange tales to tell. The Century Inn and Bar, which opened in 2006, is an elegant restaurant on Richard Street near Pender Avenue in downtown Vancouver. It's located in Century House, a classic heritage building constructed in 1911 as a Canada Permanent Mortgage Bank. After the bank closed in 1951, several other businesses set up shop there, including an insurance company, a trade school, a bookstore, and another fine restaurant. Sean Sherwood, the owner of the latest restaurant, personally survived the restoration and remodeling of the building, but there were times when he felt some otherworldly spirit was also keeping a ghostly eye on what was happening. Occasionally, when he was the only one in the place, he would hear mysterious laughter and haunting footsteps. He also got cell phone calls from what he believed was a female ghost. What's more, a carpenter reported seeing a strange woman in old-fashioned clothes walking around the place. When he asked her to leave, she gave him such a scary look that he left instead. And he wouldn't work in the building alone after that. Other workers also sensed the ghostly presence of a woman, and since the restaurant opened, some servers and diners have been disrupted by the sounds of a woman crying in an empty washroom stall. Sherwood was aware of rumors that the Century House was haunted when he finalized plans to open his new restaurant there. He'd heard the tale of how, decades ago, a female clerk was shot at the bank, either during a robbery or by her enraged husband. No one seems to have verified the story, but if it's true, could it be that the murdered woman's spirit is the otherworldly presence lingering in the Century House? A ghostly guest appearance. Georgetown, Prince Edward Island. The ghost who haunts another theater, this time in Georgetown, PEI, doesn't mind being seen. He inhabited the historic town hall, which became the King's Theater, before it suffered a serious fire in 1983. And he continued to reveal himself in the King's Playhouse that rose from its ashes. He inhabited the historic town hall, which became the King's Theater, before it suffered a serious fire in 1983. And he continued to revel himself in the King's Playhouse that rose from its ashes a few years later. Like Sam, the Calgary Ghost Haunting and the Planetarium Theater have been given a name, Captain George. And he's a bit of a prankster. Wearing an old-fashioned military officer's gray coat and carrying a lantern, he suddenly appears on stage or behind the scenes, leaving both crews and actors feeling more than a little uneasy. He's also been known to upset a few theater goers by briefly gripping their ankles. Managers at the theater finally decided to take a firm but friendly approach to dealing with Captain George. They reserved a seat specifically for him, hoping that he'd stay put in it instead of roaming around and disturbing people, especially during performances. If only he would. A disturbing guest, Winnipeg, Manitoba. The impressive-looking building at 335 Dowland Street, just north of Portage Avenue, Winnipeg, was built in 1895. Known as the Old Masonic Temple, it was the headquarters for local lodges or branches of the Masonic Order, a somewhat secretive men's organization whose members pledged loyalty to each other and support efforts to help others in the community. In 1969, not long after the Masons sold it, the building became home to a Mother Trucker's restaurant, and although the owner of the restaurant chain denied it, it was also home to a ghost. One server working there in August of 1979 actually saw the ghost for a few seconds. The apparition was that of a tall young man in a top hat and old-fashioned dress coat standing off to one side of the main room. But several other staff members who encountered the unusual restaurant guest usually just heard heard it or saw signs that it had been moving around the place. After the restaurant closed, servers would tidy up and set the tables so they would be ready for the next day's customers. But some mornings when they returned, they would find serviettes wrinkled up, salt and pepper shakers knocked over, sugar split, and knives and forks lying in disarray. As one waiter put it, the dining room looked as if someone had had a party there in the middle of the night. Tom Sacco, the manager at the time, reported that he and others would occasionally hear mysterious footsteps moving around overhead, even though he had just done a security check of the upper floors before locking up. One night, sounds of a vicious argument were also heard coming from an empty room upstairs. Generally speaking, though, staff at Mother Tucker's felt that they would put up with mysterious presence that seemed to prefer haunting the upper floors. They just did not want to be alone with it, especially not at night after closing time. A Wraith on the Ward, Vancouver, British Columbia. At the time, back in the mid-1970s, officials at Vancouver General Hospital thought it would be best if the public didn't know the hospital's burn unit might be haunted. They were probably right. After all, knowing that a ghost could be helping out with their nursing care might not be such a comforting thought for most patients suffering from very serious burns. But if nurses were right about identifying him, the unit's ghost would have been very sympathetic toward their suffering. In life, he himself had spent 3 agonizing months bravely fighting to recover from horrible burns over much of his body. This young man, referred to here as Jim, his real name was never publicly associated with the haunting, was one of 16 workers seriously injured in a major explosion and fire in a grain elevator at the Burrard Dock facilities in October 1975. Jim's injuries were the most serious. He was listed in critical condition and wasn't expected to survive. But isolated in room 415 to reduce the chance of infection, Jim somehow found the will to live and to cope with the excruciating pain caused by the third-degree burns. However, over the next several weeks, his heroic battle sapped his strength, and 3 months after the fire, he died. Nurses who had cared for Jim were very sad when he died, but in the weeks and months following his death, they began to think his spirit lived on in the burn unit, and not just in their tender memories of him. When some of them entered the room at 4:15 to check on a patient, they began to feel that another invisible presence had entered in there with him. When Nurse Denny Conrad was in the room one day getting it ready for the arrival of a new patient, he thought another staff member had followed him in carrying a tray of bandages, but when he turned around and the tray fell and there was no one else there. That instant disturbed Conrad. He didn't like the idea of being in the same room as a ghost, even if it was Jim's. Another nurse who went into 415 when no patient was there and heard sounds of deep breathing coming from the empty bed, and saw the sheets move as if a patient were tossing and turning. There were also reports of Jim visiting burn victims on the ward. One critically ill woman mentioned she just had a visit from a kindly young man she didn't know. The nurse was surprised to hear this since, as with Jim, the woman was being kept in isolation and was only allowed visits from members of her immediate family. Another time, a patient in room 413 beside Jim's old room asked a nurse to pass along his thanks to the nice young doctor who had spent time with him the night before, helping him to cope with his pain. The nurse was fairly certain no doctor had been on the ward, but she checked the records to make sure and saw that she was right. Curious, she went back and asked the patient to describe what the doctor had looked like. She wasn't at all surprised when the patient described a man who looked just like Jim. However, she didn't tell the patient that she was thinking that Jim's ghost had been making his rounds. Most of the burn unit staff at the time felt that Jim's spirit was trying to be helpful when it actually made an appearance. Those occurrences were disturbing, but tolerated and tolerable. However, some other ghostly activities were upsetting and even disruptive at times. Icy blasts of air would suddenly fill room 415. Taps opened and the toilet flushed when the bathroom was empty, and the lights often switched on and off on their own. The signal to call for a nurse's assistant would also be triggered when no patient was in the room. Some people thought that these eerie encounters were Jim's way of letting them know he was still there. Shortly before the burn unit was moved to another wing during the hospital's expansion, the unsettling incident stopped. Nurses who had cared for Jim hoped that meant he had found pain-free rest at last.